Welcome to Words with Friends, a podcast about language, community, and institutional responsibility in museums. Today we're going to be talking about the current landscape of multilingualism in U.S. museums, why it matters, and what the work of making museums multilingual actually looks like. My name is Olivia, and I'm a senior at Smith College. I spent the last few years working here as a museum educator, along with being a full-time student at Smith. Working with a wide range of K-12 student groups, I think a lot about accessibility and equity. This is something that extends past my own teaching practice all the way to how I think about museums as a whole. And language is just one element of that question of access in museums. It's something that's particularly interesting to me as someone who studies language. And this matters because over the past 40 years, the amount of people in the US who speak more than one language at home has tripled. So back in 1980, that number was at 23.1 million. But today, it's at 67.8 million. So there are almost 70 million people in the US who speak another language natively. And at the same time, over these past 40 years, there's been this cultural shift in museums. At the turn of the century, we see the emergence of this idea of the 21st century museum. Now, this is a museum that centers human experiences rather than objects. This doesn't mean that we stop caring for collections or that they lose their value. Rather, we acknowledge the fact that there is no reason for any of these objects to be cared for if people can't have meaningful experiences with them. Most of this podcast is going to focus on English-Spanish bilingual initiatives. Now, I didn't seek out only Spanish-related initiatives, even though I study and speak Spanish, but given national data, it kind of makes sense. Spanish is the second most spoken language in the US, but next on that list are Chinese, Tagalog, Vietnamese, and Arabic. I want to be explicit that there is way more beyond what I'm talking about today. And in that same vein, the upcoming interviews and case studies that you're about to hear are not meant to speak for every possibility of multilingualism. I'm really excited to share all that I've learned this semester, along with some amazing interviews. Before we get into my research, I want to define a few terms. So I use the word multilingual more frequently than I use the word bilingual. And that's because I use it sort of as an umbrella term. So in other words, when I'm using the word multilingual, I'm talking about anything with two or more languages, kind of just depending on each individual case. Also, you might hear me use the phrase interpretive materials. This refers to anything that connects people to museum collections or helps them make meaning from them. This can look like a label next to a painting, an audio guide for visitors, activity booklets for kids, etc. And I do want to point out that generally these kinds of materials assume literacy and rely heavily on text, though this isn't always the case. Now, this podcast was part of my senior capstone project in museum studies, so I did a lot of research. I want to highlight just a few of the sources that were the most useful for me in framing the scope of this podcast. One article is called Creating Equitable Ecologies, Broadening Access Through Multilingualism. This was written by two experts who have spent their whole careers engaging with questions of language, diversity, and inclusion. Mary Esther Soto Huerta is a professor of education at Texas State University. She specializes in bilingual teacher education and equity in education for language minority students. Laura Huerta Amigos is the former executive director of the Association for Children's Museums and now is deputy director of museum services at the National Institute of Museum and Library Services. This article addresses the fact that historically museums have catered to white, upper, and middle-class audiences. Also, how things like race, immigration status, citizenship, socioeconomic status overlap in very complex ways that can make museums inaccessible to marginalized groups in America. This article talks about museums as microcosms of society that can perpetuate ideas about nationhood and belonging. And it also talks about specific requisites for belonging in the United States. Things like citizenship, ancestry, language proficiency. And the fact that if museums are not critically engaging with exclusionary ideas within their society, they are likely to perpetuate them. And then they look at some case studies from science museums, mostly from the American Southwest, to measure how incorporating multilingual interpretation has changed public engagement. Something really interesting to note is that these changes don't only increase public engagement, they support the cultural competency of museum staff, and they influence how people engage with the museum. Ultimately, these two scholars are looking at real-world examples of how engaging with multilingualism helps museums to challenge dominant conceptions of American identity, as well as conceptions of who belongs in the museum. Now, the next article I read was written by Jungmin Kwon, a professor of education at Michigan State University, whose research focuses on bilingualism and biliteracy in the context of transnational immigration and immigrant families. Kwon's article, Parent-Child Translanguaging Among Transnational Immigrant Families in Museums, is all about this concept of translanguaging, which she studies through ethnographic research of 3 Korean American families. Translanguaging can be defined as the process of a bilingual or multilingual person switching between languages fluidly. It's someone using all languages at their disposal to make meaning of the world around them. She cites the profound benefits of translanguaging in children: metacognitive ability, metalinguistic knowledge, and higher order thinking skills. Kwon reports that one child from her study who was not yet fluent in Korean, quote, used translanguaging to support her understanding of unfamiliar terms or artifacts. The more proficient children switched between languages in order to enhance their existing linguistic and cultural knowledge. In her study, she includes dialogues between parents and children, switching from Korean to English. So we see this in the recorded dialogues between parents and children, in which they're free to switch from one language to the other. In a museum environment wherein parents and children parse out collections in multiple languages, translanguaging becomes a tool for language learning, intergenerational connection, and collective meaning making. This can happen in any location and any context, but an already multilingual environment like a museum can invite the development of these skills, which brings us to our next source. Finally, I want to talk about one of the most helpful resources in this research, which was the Bilingual Exhibitions Research Initiative, or BERRY. This is a National Science Foundation funded project through the Advancing Informal STEM Learning Program. The movement to fill gaps in scholarship about multilingualism in museums only began to really take off in the early 2010s, and BERRY was at the forefront of this change. Through this reporting, they conducted staff interviews and collected visitor data from Spanish-English exhibitions at science museums in the U.S. I'm just going to go through a few of the findings from BERRY's research, and I would recommend that you read their entire report because it's super interesting and can kind of clear up some of those confusions about what the benefits of this really are and what it's supposed to look like in practice. I'm just going to go through a couple of the findings from BERRY's final report. One finding is that bilingual exhibits supported code switching, which is kind of like that translanguaging skill I talked about earlier. Next, having access to content in their native language helped parents take on the role of facilitator for their kids in these informal learning environments. And thus, they were taking on a more active role in collaborative learning. Perhaps most obviously is access to content, so more people who only spoke Spanish were able to access information about science and the environment, etc., because there was text in their native languages and multimedia interpretation in their native languages in these museums. Bilingual exhibitions also helped people who were stronger in one of the two languages strengthen their non-dominant language. So, for example, Spanish-only visitors reported feeling more comfortable practicing English because they could refer to Spanish text that was on the wall and kind of get a better understanding of what they were reading, and vice versa. So people who were better at English were getting better at Spanish because there was that compare and contrast between the two bilingual texts. And finally, this encouraged people to connect to their cultures, especially intergenerationally. So they found that it was especially important for Spanish-speaking parents with English dominant children to get that linguistic exposure to Spanish somewhere outside the home as well. It was also important for me to supplement my research with interviews to hear directly from people who are doing this kind of work in the field. So much of the existing literature on this topic centered around science or history museums, especially because Barry, funded by the National Science Foundation, contributed immensely to the existing research. And this was super helpful and was an amazing jumping off point for me, and I don't think I could have done any of this research without the work that Barry did. But I was curious about art museums and children's museums specifically because that's where my experience working in museums lies. And I wanted to take a more local approach by focusing on case studies in Massachusetts and New York. Nick Capasso is the director of the Fitchburg Art Museum in Fitchburg, Massachusetts. FAM is the first museum in New England to become fully bilingual in English and Spanish materials. I spoke to Nick about what this transition entailed.
We wanted to make sure this was done professionally and in an equitable way. So we made the decision to invest in this and pay a professional translator. Because one of the things you learn when you start doing Spanish language translations is that in this country, there is no one Spanish language. There are as many Spanish languages as there are communities of Spanish speakers. And so what we had to do was find a way to make the Spanish language that we were delivering as, let's say, palatable as possible to the people who actually live in our community. And so in Fitchburg, we have a very large Latino population. The plurality of these folks are Puerto Rican, and the greatest demographic growth was in the Puerto Rican community. So we were very fortunate to have a Puerto Rican Spanish speaker on our staff, and he would read everything that the translator sent and just tweak it a little bit so it would be more appropriate for the plurality of our audience.
There's so much intentionality, care, and attention dedicated to this decade-long process at FAM. As you could guess, it's not the kind of thing that happened all at once.
When we made the decision to go bilingual, we didn't replace all the text in the museum overnight. That would have been impossible given our budget and our capacity. We're a small regional art museum. So the decision we made in 2013 was every time we updated an exhibition, every time we changed over an exhibition, all the text would appear in English and Spanish in one way or another. And we also made the decision at that time to make sure that our reception staff were bilingual and that we had members of our security team who could speak Spanish as well.
And so it's not just about text, it's also about the people who are interacting with visitors in the museum on a daily basis. You'll hear throughout all of these interviews that a prominent theme is updating the museum for the 21st century, going back to that idea of what makes a 21st century museum. The question of how are museums going to show up for their communities and their audiences?
When the trustees of the museum hired me, they were looking for a director who would revitalize the museum and kind of bring it into the 21st century. And they also wanted the museum to participate in the revitalization of the city of Fitchburg. So we've been working in various ways to figure out the path forward. And part of the path forward was to become far more community oriented. And actually, we changed our mission to include that. And so if we were going to be a people-centric museum in a city with a 30% Latino demographic, we needed to be serving everybody in the city, not just the white people. One of the fastest and easiest things we could do to perform outreach to the Latino community was the Spanish translations, because that's something that we can control that. We can do that. The other thing we realized is that's not going to solve the problem in and of itself. It's just part of the solution because there are multiple barriers to or between the museum and the Latino community. One is language, and we talked about that. Another is the fact that it's an economically challenged community. So we address that by setting up a whole range of different free and reduced admissions programs. Still not solving the problem, but part of solving the problem is economically revitalizing the city so people are making more money. And we're working on that too. The third problem is that in Latin America, in the communities where these folks grew up, art museums remain deeply elitist institutions. So these folks weren't welcome in the museum back home. Why in the world would they presume that they would be welcome in the Gringo Museum in Massachusetts?
This is an example of a museum administration that understands its audience in a comprehensive way. So all of these things are really interdependent, and without an intersectional approach, it's hard to get multilingual interpretation to really work.
And so we've addressed that in lots of different ways, primarily through our work with the public schools. So we have a very strong relationship with the Fitchburg Public Schools. And part of that is for reasons of equity, because 70% of the kids in the public school are Latino. This is a generational investment. You can't just do one thing and think it's going to solve the problem. The choice to include another language is also symbolic. It engenders trust in the museum. And it also reflects the complexity of generational linguistic change in immigrant communities. So we find that when people from the Latino community come and visit the Fitchburg Art Museum, they usually come in family groups, grandparents, parents, kids. And across that age spectrum, different people have different fluency with English and Spanish. So what the simultaneous presence of English language and Spanish language, it lets people code switch within families. So they're having conversations about the art, they're having conversations about the language, and it's all learning. In an economically challenged environment, we find that the only way you can succeed is by partnering with other organizations. Nobody in North Central Massachusetts can go it alone. So we have partnered with many different organizations that already have the trust of the Latino community, social service organizations, the public schools, primarily. And as I mentioned, the public schools is one of our greatest allies. Well, when I got to the Fitchburg Art Museum, it really was the hushed temple of the fine arts for the right white people, and had been since its founding in the 1920s. And now it's a trusted center of the community. So people choose to come to the museum. The people who attend the museum are more representative of the demographic of our community than it used to be overall. But we still have work to do. Like I said, it's a generational thing. Can't just do one program and then wonder why, I mean, I've seen this over and over again. Museums will do the big Latino show and they invite everybody and everybody comes and then lots of happy talk and then they think that's going to solve the problem. Decisions about multilingualism should be based on mission and should be based on demographic and not on the static demographic.
Nick shared with me that he's spoken with people who want to make the push for multilingual interpretation, but think that it might be just too hard to practically implement. Here's what he had to say.
And the answer is, no, it's not. It's not that hard. It really isn't. You just have to have the will and the budget. You just have to. And do you have to pay, do you have to pay? Yeah, you got to pay translators. You got to pay for extra vinyl and extra, stuff. But it's not that much. If you're committed to it, you can find the money to do it. It doesn't have to be done overnight. You can phase it in as long as you're working towards it in a consistent way, right? You have to have the director and the trustees aligned behind the will to do this, because you can't rely on your education department or your marketing department to do it alone, because when that happens, you get piecemeal solutions. In the times we are in right now, this work is increasingly important. We need to be strong and live our values and continue to do this despite external pressure from the federal government.
Since its opening in 2017, the Amazing World of Dr. Seuss Museum in Springfield has prioritized bilingual education. Part of the reason that they were able to do this is because of the state budget. So in 2018, the museum received $100,000 from the state to help them achieve bilingual programming. Legislators supported this funding package because they knew it would be beneficial across the board. Some of the reasoning behind this package was more equitable community engagement, increased tourism, and literacy support for children in the area. I talked to Daniela Campos, program coordinator at the museum, to learn more about what this looks like today.
And once you officially walk through the building, each of the plaques all around each has an English translation, and then right beneath it, it has a Spanish translation.
Daniela is in charge of Cat's Corner, the Dr. Seuss Museum's literacy-based arts and crafts space.
Down within Cat's Corner, I have bilingual books, but also books in different languages as well, for our many different visitors that have different languages as well. I try to bring on new volunteers and staff that speak other languages as well, that they are comfortable with speaking with visitors in the space. If I notice that they speak Spanish or a language that I'm comfortable with speaking, I will translate to them what we're doing. If the child is a little old enough where they can start saying words back, they will repeat the words that their parents tell them to. And I love seeing that moment where the children are repeating the words back, but they also see the many different words that are on the walls as well for the murals.
Museums are places for informal and experiential learning. They extend learning outside of the classroom, and they meet people where they're at. So museums like the Amazing World of Dr. Seuss Museum can really supplement the kind of literacy training kids are getting in school. And they can also provide an opportunity for everybody to be exposed to new languages.
That gives me that aha moment, because they are learning something. And even if it's through the arts and crafts that we do in the space, they are still learning something, even though if it's a small something. I plan on bringing more Dr. Seuss books. So I have a library of a couple of his books in different languages. So I have French, I have Russian, I have Chinese, Japanese. I'm trying to get more books in the aspect so that way I can add it to my collection of books that I have within the space.
Daniela also pointed out to me that language is only one part of making museums accessible.
But I also make the space accessible for families with special needs children and have different learning abilities. I have a couple hand mobility aids for those students as well, but we offer our second Sunday of the month, which is our sensory friendly Sundays. And so that's more based off of for the families with children with special needs and different abilities. And so I do have Braille books. I also have some sensory toys, and we also make the crafter that week accessible for those children if they want that. No matter what language the child speaks, I try to include them in a way that they understand and basically just provide them a welcoming experience along with their families. And it's just amazing what you can see within a space that works with children and families, and you can learn how they grow and how they learn as individuals.
Museum education also plays an important role at the Queens Museum in New York, where the education department is making strides to support their immigrant populations. Queens, New York is one of the most linguistically and culturally diverse communities in the world. I talked to Guido Garaycochea, who manages the New New Yorkers program at the Queens Museum. I wanted to know more about what this program means for the people that it serves and how it came to be.
It's a place to make a community. It's a place that uses, I guess, classes as a tool to connect people here. The New Yorkers is a place where most people in New York that they were not born here, but they ended up living here, as myself, get together and having some classes, getting some new tools to navigate life, but at the same time that they are building relationships and creating a new network that is going to, in a way, replace that network that we lose when we move from one country to another. More or less, the kind of programs that we have are like long term workshops. It's not like one time workshops. It's something that you can build new ways of understanding not only the reality that the new reality that we are living on, but also getting to know more the resources that the city provides and everything through a very friendly conversations and sometimes visiting another places, another other different museums, for example.
The Queens Museum is very clear in their goals regarding this program: uplifting new New Yorkers to enrich their lives, feel welcome, and build community networks.
At this specific moment, we are only offering Spanish and English. We used to, well, and sometimes Mandarin, but our strong one is Spanish right now, Spanish and English. But we used to offer as many languages as you can imagine in a borough where 180 live languages we have. So we had not only Mandarin, but we have Korean, we have Bengali, even we have had Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, and some other languages. Through the years that I've been dealing with this program, we have had many, but really many different languages. I think the program started by realizing the place we are in, which is we're in the middle of a park, and most of the people that were circulating in the park, I was told by the founder of the program, the people that in the park, they didn't have any idea that it was a museum. They just saw a building. So they were inviting people to come into the museum. A big building sometimes can be intimidating for the people. So they were in the park. They were playing with the kids, etc. But they didn't feel like invited to the museum. So they went outside and they were inviting people, telling people, one by one, what else the museum was providing to the community, but at the same time doing this partnership with Queen's Library. So going with our teaching artists and having the workshops in the different locations of branches of the library, it was also a way of letting people know that we exist here.
The Queens Museum is a shining example of a museum doing community outreach.
You have to have a reason, and you have to know that the museum exists in order to be here. And there is a wonderful reason with our workshops, and it has been like that at least for I think 17 years more or less, which is what this program has been. I mean, the lifespan that this program has had. Yeah.
I asked Guido what engagement at the Queens Museum typically looks like and how it's changed over time.
At times where the museum has been really, really crowded, and some other times, like during during the pandemic that it was even more crowded. Why? Because this is a community-oriented museum, so we used to run, we were providing food for people here. At that time, and it was during the pandemic, so we really were helping our community, not only with art, but also with, more practical things. That lasted until a year and a half ago. And so we had a museum really, really crowded all at that time. That doesn't mean that now it's empty. That means that now we went back to normal times where people came and as a place to meeting together here at the museum, but also for the classes. And for sure, this is a museum of contemporary art. They came to see our really interesting exhibitions that we have here.
In some cases, it even inspired visitors to take on entirely new careers in a new city.
We had many different people that after the workshop that we had about photography and video making, they make a living with those resources. Yeah. So I think that, being a museum of art and sometimes questioning yourself about the practicity of art, the education and the classes that we have been offering, have been like very instrumental for people to create a new life here. Also for our population here around there. Most of them they were not born in this city. Also has given us the possibility of witnessing firsthand how art can be so therapeutic.
I was also curious about what the future of this program might look like.
I hope it's successful, and I hope the program will be able to change according to the needs of the new needs of the moment.
I asked Guido if there was a moment where the Queen's Museum saw an overwhelming amount of engagement. I was surprised to hear that his answer was the COVID-19 pandemic.
The pandemic changed our life forever. For a couple of years, we were doing all our classes by Zoom, and that was a very, very successful way of getting into a lot of people while we were confined in our houses. And we had classes with the top of the capacity that we have. I think in our Zoom that was 100 or 110 or something, and we have all these people, attending the classes, and not only at some point it was not only from New York, but from other states and other countries. So because because of the population that we serve, so people from Latin America, people from China were attending our classes. And that was really something that now is I can remember with proud, what we did. Things are different. We are back to more or less in-person classes, which is very, very important. And you cannot really compare, one with the effectivity of one with the other. But it was really a tool to go through that traumatic time with our making classes through the internet, and at the same time, and it was incredible, even at that time, making community. The program was called, the general program at that time was called La Ventanita, the little window, because there were so many little windows on the screen, and people from my part that I was sometimes, providing the class, because I'm an artist, I was doing some classes on painting classes. So you could see people from one place to the other. They were talking also and exchanging, ideas from one country to the other country. So it was really not only because it was really amazing to see this, but also because of the need as social animals that we are to interact with other people. So really, I think it's one of the top moment of the program that it was unexpected. It was not planned. It's just that we did what we could, at the moment that things happen.
I think this program is so successful because it is centered around adapting to its community. You know, those core values of flexibility, sustainability, and meaningful listening to the needs of the people. I haven't had the opportunity to go see the Queen's Museum in person, so I wanted to know what role multilingualism played inside the galleries, especially in terms of interpretation.
That is something that I was very part of at the very beginning. I'm pushing for that. I'm talking about 6, 7 years ago. Well, it was first it was budget. Okay, but there were some volunteer, work that you can do and doing the translation, etc. And then slowly they understood, and also because the change of the director and new people came and had a fresh a view of things and the importance of doing that and it was a kind of, yeah, that's what we have to do. And so we must have a budget for this, and we have to find some grants that can cover this. So there was the need was really on the table, and to say we don't have resources was not an answer anymore. Now it's, yeah, like every single exhibition has interpretation and English, Spanish, and my voice is less now there because they are now, very professional people that are doing that. I was one of the voices that really said at a moment back in the past that is really needed, and we have now. I'm saying that we have to go to English, Spanish, and Mandarin. We are still with English, Spanish. So there is more work to be made in the future. But I think that we are going to get it.
Something that we can learn from all three of these interviews is that bilingualism in museums does not only increase public engagement, it transforms it. As a symbolic gesture, it tells people that they are welcome without having to mask or hide their cultures and languages. It also allows for engagement and learning on a more profound level. It makes museums more relevant and impactful. This kind of work cannot be done overnight, but I hope from these interviews the process will seem a little bit more approachable. These programs have real-world impact. Multilingualism in the museum is an institutional investment. When you do it with care, it pays off. With museums across the country facing budget cuts at the hands of Trump's administration, it's hard to know what the future holds. Even the National Science Foundation, whose funding of Barry was so invaluable to my research, is currently halting funding. But I think we can take the wisdom from Nick, Daniela, and Guido to heart. Bilingualism will always be a core part of a museum's responsibility to serve their communities as cultural resources. If there's anything we can learn from these interviews, it's that museums can and do weather unprecedented changes. They can and do adapt. Thank you for listening to Words with Friends. This podcast could not have been possible without the support of Jessica Nicoll, Charlene Shang Miller, and my MUX classmates. Additionally, I would like to thank Abril Navarro and Travis Grandy for their support with tech and media production. Finally, a huge thank you to Nick, Daniela, and Guido for taking time out of their busy schedules to speak with me and contribute to this podcast. I'm so humbled by the work you do, and I'm so honored to have gotten the chance to speak with each one of you. Until next time, this has been an episode of Words with Friends.